Welcome to Secondary Cities, Primary Opportunities, a podcast which aims to highlight the significance of secondary cities and the issues that they face, emphasizing the value of smaller-scale urbanization and regional growth. I am Monica Laucas, an economist at Buro Appold, and I'm here with my fellow hosts and Buro Appold colleagues, Arturo Reyes, a sustainability consultant.
Hello.
And Paul Norman, environmental consultant.
Hello, good to be here.
Today we will discuss the concept of shrinking smart, a term which refers to strategies and approaches that are used by cities experiencing population decline to manage and adapt to their changing circumstances effectively. To unpack this topic, we are joined by an expert in the field, Dr. Bozhidar Ivanov, who is an urban researcher and research project manager at Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Welcome.
Hello, and thanks for the invitation.
Bozhidar has dedicated his PhD to this topic, researching policy and planning alternatives to address urban shrinkage and population decline through cross-national comparative studies of approaches from Spain, the Netherlands and Germany. So I think it would be a great start to the podcast to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about the concept of shrinking smart.
I think it's very nice that there's still interest in this topic because when the discussions about shrinking smart started somewhere in the 2000s, it was considered as something quite innovative, but the biggest question was what does it mean actually to shrink smartly? And I think this is the reason why I actually got the chance to write my PhD on the topic. But as Monica, you mentioned, some cities gradually started experiencing different challenges related to population decline. And in most of the cases, these challenges and the whole population decline in general started to be perceived as a complete crisis because of this constant reflex that bigger is better and that growth is the only way to go. So whenever shrinkage started occurring in different places across the world, specifically mostly in Western countries, which is where my research was focused, such as in Western Europe or the US, different scientists, especially from some networks dedicated to urban shrinkage, started asking, okay, what can we do about this to turn this shrinkage or this population decline into an opportunity or maybe a chance to improve cities rather than just seeing it as a crisis. So this is basically the core idea behind shrinking smart. How can we turn population decline and its associated challenges into an opportunity to improve cities, to make them a better place to live, to maybe take advantage of this situation? What does it offer as opposed to a situation where the population is growing and respectively associated challenges with this arise? And last but not least, to also consider quality of life as a way to measure whether a certain city is a good place to live or not just the growth. So this is at the core of the idea. However, I did have the chance to research this in a more extensive way, let's say it like this, over 3 years in Kaiserslautern in Germany. And I do have some more input on this topic, specifically with some practical solutions that might be helpful for cities right now.
Thank you for this introduction. And it's very important what you said about the fact that growth is not, cities do not necessarily need to go on a growth trajectory. Actually, for livability and quality of life, it's more important about being well planned and optimize resources and the use of infrastructure. So even if the population becomes smaller, that can give good opportunities to cities. It's a very important topic. Would you like to say a bit more about that example in Germany you just mentioned?
Yes, indeed. So you mentioned the infrastructure and some other associated challenges, but here it's really important to first understand maybe what factors contribute to population decline, how how those differ between the different examples. And I think what you mentioned about the infrastructure, for instance, this might be a consequence of population decline. So a city that used to be a big city with many people and had, let's say, a certain infrastructure that was adapted to this huge size. If the population decline was severe, then the infrastructure becomes more or less bigger than needed. So this might result in a challenge to manage it, including associated costs, etc. But this is only one scenario of urban shrinkage dynamics. I would say that it really depends on, respectively, the specific context and example, of course. But the most common case is cities, as you mentioned, secondary cities, so cities that had a certain significance maybe in the past because of, let's say, industrial production or being a key node in the old ways, the old economic ways, or the old economic dynamics, especially extractive industries, for instance. They might have reached a certain peak of population at some point. But then gradually, because of certain reasons, they start to lose this population. So that's probably the most common example of cities that have shrunk over time. However, there is also the other option where other factors contribute to population decline, and it's more steady over time. So it's not such a shock because a certain economic activity was downsized or closed, and then this led to outmigration. But there is also the other case where we have long-term trajectories of population decline that might be influenced by factors that go beyond the certain city. For instance, if it's a whole country that gradually loses population because of demographic reasons or other reasons as well, this can also trigger urban shrinkage on local level. So depending on these factors and depending on the specific trajectory, the way that urban shrinkage manifests and the consequences of it might be different.
Just a quick one from me. Provide a bit of kind of context on the type of cities we're looking at. I think you mentioned as an example, was it Kaiserslautern in Germany? But you mentioned you've kind of looked at cities in Europe and the US, perhaps you mentioned. Is there a particular type of city, or what sort of indicators or criteria are of a city? Are there any kind of similarities that make a city susceptible to population decline, just to kind of set the scene before we kind of then think about how they can shrink smart?
Yes, I would say that the most common example is population decline as a result of economic downsizing. So in the US, most of the examples, although they weren't fully included in my research, but they're kind of very paradigmatic for the field, are usually cities in the Rust Belt in the US, where especially extractive industries, or let's say car production, with Detroit being the more or less the textbook example where everything started. So cities that had a significant or even a main leading, even globally, role in a certain industry, suddenly when this industry shifted to another country or the other part of the planet, respectively Asia, the consequences of this definitely were quite shocking for the local level, because many people actually lost their jobs or fled the city, or the city just remained more or less emptied as a result of this. Similarly, in Germany and in Spain, two of the examples that I've studied, which are Leipzig and Bilbao, they're both cities that used to have a specific economic profile, especially in their peak time, which was modified somehow or changed as a result of different factors that influenced the economic activity in the city. So I would say that this is the most common example of cities losing population, a certain economic activity that was key to the city that somehow was restructured or closed, and this triggered the consequences after that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Maybe we'll get into this, but it seems like the city would, as well as losing the population, if that industry's gone, it also loses its kind of sense of identity as well, in many cases, perhaps, if it's known for manufacturing cars or steelworks or these sorts of things.
Exactly, which also brings the social dimension of urban shrinkage, which is sometimes when we just look from urban planning perspective, we kind of tend to overlook this or just look at it from the perspective of spatial dimensions. But it's always also a social story and also an individual story for all of the people that were involved in this let's say, identity building through economic activity. And usually some of the challenges that are associated with urban shrinkage go beyond the spatial elements, or beyond vacancy, beyond abandoned industrial areas, or just lack of economic activity. They also manifest as social issues such as unemployment or marginalized communities. So indeed, it's a more complex story as opposed to just losing population.
Yeah, actually, interesting that you mentioned Detroit as the textbook case study, because it's when I was studying urban sociology, that was definitely one of the examples that we studied, and we compared it often with Turin in Italy, which went through very similar challenges at the same time. They both lost their car manufacturing, but Turin had to reinvent itself and completely reshift the city identity by shifting from an industrial hub and car manufacturing to then rediscovering its cultural identity, as it used to be the capital of the reign of Italy before Italy was unified. So there was a massive effort from the municipality to create a city of culture, city of cinema, and actually regenerate the center of the city. And it did take a while, but it was quite successful. And I think Detroit is also trying to now, well, it's been happening for the past 15 to 20 years to rediscover its cultural identity and create more sense of community through the empty spaces that have been vacated through the industry buildings.
Indeed, cultural regeneration is definitely a well-recognized strategy for cities, and it's also quite attractive because it's not that it's easy to build, but it's very attractive when you build it and you can try to sell it. But the question is whether this is the only choice that they can make, and whether it's really because of the culture or it's because of the associated economic effects that are expected from it.
Yes. Yeah, we have one of the episodes on our podcast is on regeneration through cultural identity. One of the biggest challenge, I guess, that cities that are undergoing shrinkage, they will face is probably lack of access to finance. So they enter a vicious cycle of not being able to access funds, not being able to improve, people feeling more disenfranchised and fleeing or not wanting to invest in the place where they live.
It's a chance to get out of.
This is definitely one of the biggest challenges with access to funds, and then what do you do with the funds even if you have them? And this is where actually certain national support is more or less required for these cities. This is one of the findings that I kind of managed to identify from my research, that very, very unlikely for a city to be able to recover or to address their urban shrinkage without any external support, be it national funds, be it a dedicated program, be it European funds, if we're talking about the EU. But there's definitely a need for these cities to receive external support, both from the perspective of funds and also from the perspective of capacity, so they can improve their governance. One example from this is, for instance, Germany, where Leipzig, as I mentioned, is one of the examples that I had, and it's in Eastern Germany, and its shrinkage was part of a bigger story about the population decline in Eastern Germany after the reunification of the country. And actually the federal government stepped in by providing extra funds and additional support for all cities that are experiencing these consequences of this shift of population. Because what happened is that many people moved from the east to the west. So it's not only Leipzig, but what happened is that the federal government actually stepped in with a long-term program. So we're talking about at least 10 years of more or less secure funding with different scope, of course, and with different requirements, but the support was there. If we bring this experience to nowadays, I would say that this is either more or less mandatory for some sort of support on national level, or maybe European funds can be used for this additional support to cities. But it's very difficult to imagine a shrinking city to try to find the resources on their own. Yeah, maybe another alternative is to look for like local initiatives and maybe like some smart ideas on local level, but they're just so small in scale that they can never be enough to address a bigger issue that they might be experiencing.
Do you think also it's important that these plannings, when they have identified the problem and they're planning to find a way out, diversifying the strategy? Because I think in some cities, like, I mean, and of course you know more about this, but like about when it was the cultural office, the Guggenheim, that really kind of was the trigger. But I think in some other cities we've seen that just putting all the eggs in one basket can be counterproductive, because then if that fails, that the whole plan fails. But I think, have you seen that implemented when it's an overall strategy? And yeah, one of the strategies might be the biggest bet, but you have to also kind of look at other things that could provide more certainty and security.
Indeed, yes, I completely agree that putting all the eggs in one basket is a risky strategy, and I think this is where probably the story of Bilbao really comes up. But there is more to it than just the flagship things there, actually. But I think this relates to the overall reflex of planning again to focus on growth, because by betting everything on one symbolic project, this is basically betting on the promise that this project is going to grow and this project is going to equal more migration into the city, more economic activity, etc., etc. So immediately jumping back to the growth trajectory by replacing what was there before, or by creating something new that's supposed to become the new motor of the city to move it to growth again. So it's a more fundamental question, I think, that whether a planning decision is seen only as a growth replacement or as a universal solution to the shrinkage versus a more integrated and broader strategy. And going back to Bilbao's case, my research actually helped me to understand that it wasn't just the Guggenheim and the flagship initiatives there. And they learned this quite quickly because the Guggenheim was built quite early in their whole trajectory, like in the middle of the 90s, whereas the process actually continues even until today, because Bilbao is more or less with a stable population right now, but it's far from growing. It's just more or less staying around the same threshold. But they did realize that if it's just the museum, it's not going to work. So what they did was actually expand. So, okay, the museum was already there. Even the decision was taken like before the whole process of managing the decline. So they tried to expand on this and complement the cultural regeneration, which was, it's considered cultural, but it's more economic, I would say, with specific targeted actions in, let's say, neighborhoods that were actually severely impacted by the depopulation or by the associated social challenges, for instance, unemployment or bad housing, or even environmental consequences, because Bilbao has a very specific topography, and they're quite susceptible to floods, etc. So they actually managed to upgrade all this by targeting specific funds and specific programs to different parts of the city, so that the city actually starts transforming beyond just the center, which is the new shiny piece that they have there. Leipzig actually followed something similar. They also identified specific weak spots, weak not necessarily in a negative way, but spots that actually need some intervention across the city. And the actions there were combined with economic activity, with social support, with housing interventions, and with even local initiatives. So this is the type of integrated planning that shrinking cities require. They shouldn't definitely not look to just one thing that will drive growth again, because in most cases, probably it's not going to work.
Can I ask a question about infrastructure? Because you touched on it before, and I can imagine, so cities, the scale and type of infrastructure that they use grows relatively gradually, I guess, with a city as its population grows. But in some of the examples that you mentioned, like, I guess there's probably been a bit of a population crash in relative terms. It's dropped suddenly. How can infrastructure be used in a smart way, or downsized quickly, or repurposed, or things? Are there ways that city planners can be smart about the use of infrastructure following when you end up with a city that doesn't really fit the infrastructure that it's been built for?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the key word here is reuse and repurposing. This is one of the recommendations that I give as part of the Shrinking Smart concept that I developed, is that specifically for infrastructure, the leading point, and basically for anything related to spatial planning, the first reflex should be reuse and repurposing and using whatever is available there, as opposed to building something new. The question here is what type of infrastructure we're talking about and who owns it. This is a very key question, because depending on the planning system and depending on the specific context in the country, doing something with a certain infrastructure might not be as easy as it seems just from planning perspective. So let's just resize this road or just remove this railway. But if it's not within the city's competences to actually do this, it becomes a very challenging bureaucratic maze that they need to maneuver. And this is where the stakeholder engagement kind of becomes important, that we shouldn't expect that cities should resolve all their issues on their own, but they should also partner up with other public institutions or private, depending on who is involved, to actually figure out the solutions together. Since we mentioned Bilbao, I'll just stick with them because they have a very interesting example of resizing their railway infrastructure, which is something that I looked at. Because of the topography that I mentioned, the way that the railway was built in Bilbao is quite impressive, I would say, from engineering standpoint. So basically, the railways would separate the city in different parts. And one of the challenges that they had was certain neighborhoods were basically isolated with bad housing, bad history, and even marginalized communities in them. So they wanted to open up the city to make sure that people can actually mix up and connect. So what they did was to cover these railway tracks and submerge them also underground, upgrade their metro system as well by connecting the existing lines, improving the public transport of the city and even of the whole region in this process, and also creating new public spaces on top of the existing infrastructure. So I would say that this is a very interesting and very nice example, especially if you go to Bilbao and see how it looks like. It's really impressive because if you see before and after, it's just like two different cities completely.
Yeah, I'd love to visit. It's on my to visit list. In that sort of example, then, how do you think it's been successful in also, I guess, kind of intersecting the way it's planned or resizing infrastructure with maybe like sustainability goals and targets or addressing aspects if there's like flooding or drainage or suds, and incorporating these sorts of things into it as well? Or is there a place where these can kind of intersect?
Yes, I think so. Maybe if we stick with the Bilbao example, but also something similar happened in Leipzig as well. But in Bilbao, the former industry was actually in the center of the city on the river. And the river was actually quite contaminated, like, in a very, very bad example, as a consequence of very heavy industry because they were doing steel production, etc. So actually, as part of the creation of the new public spaces and the regeneration of the city, they also managed to decontaminate the river and basically make it into a public space, which is now accessible, and basically you can walk along the promenade, etc. Leipzig did something similar by upgrading this forest belt, which is because Leipzig has like two centers in a way. So between the two central parts, there is a belt of a natural area which previously wasn't well maintained, but they actually used it as part of the process to first create better green spaces, and second to also kind of integrate it into their climate change adaptation strategy.
I think on the story of reuse as well, we were recently in Athens on a research trip, and we saw that I started looking at historical buildings just abandoned there, like rambling, and we were touring with architects, and I started asking, and they said that because the policy is so stringent on the protection of heritage buildings, you have to go through a very meticulous process of taking it exactly to where it was back in the day, and that's very prohibited. So it's limiting the capacity to retrofit those buildings. And I think while Athens is probably not really a secondary city, we see those in smaller cities that definitely don't have the budgets to do these retrofits. Do you think it's a merely policy change that needs to make it easier on kind of a planning level to retrofit those buildings, or is it also kind of a private shift in just let them crumble mysteriously catch fire or something, so we can build large scale buildings?
I think it really depends on the planning system and how this is regulated. I'm not surprised that in Greece the regulation is so strict due to historical reasons, I guess. But it really depends on the specific context, on whether these buildings we want to preserve them as part of our new identity, and what their role is going to be in the future. So are they going to be repurposed also in terms of use, or they're going to become just a tourist attraction or something else? And then to actually not just look for a quick solution to make sure that you can do whatever you want with this building, but rather engage with the public stakeholder that actually owns this building, or the private owner, if that's the case, and make sure that the way that this building or this project is integrated into the long-term strategy is also beneficial for them. And this is where these differences between planning systems come into play, because again, we should not expect the cities to solve this on their own. If we go back to the Bilbao example, they actually worked with all of the other public stakeholders, including the National Railway Infrastructure of Spain, the company that actually owns the tracks, to actually figure out the way to do it together. So for the cultural heritage, I think it's also the same. In a way, they just need to make sure that the planning process of figuring out what to do in the long term also involves all the other stakeholders, rather than just going rogue and wanting to fix everything on their own.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. It's more community effort.
In the examples that you've studied, how quickly did the municipality react to this decline? And was it mostly something that was started from the municipality, or was it more bottom-up at the neighborhood scale, where groups self-organized to then attract more interest at the wider city scale?
I think in both of the trajectories that I studied in more detail, we're talking about processes that encompass at least 10 years. In most of the cases, let's say it's about 15 years to actually see more or less a stable result of an ongoing continuous effort to address shrinkage. And I think that's one of the challenges that planners might face, because we need to ensure that if someone wants to turn their shrinkage into smart shrinkage, they also need this buy-in also in political level, that no matter what changes happen in the governance of the city, then the efforts will more or less continue with a long-term strategy, with a long-term action plan, and the corresponding investment. And this is where actually winning the local communities becomes quite important. And indeed, the community engagement is an essential part of whichever strategy to address shrinkage is chosen. In both of my cases, there were bottom-up initiatives that were involved, mostly in the neighborhoods that were being regenerated or addressed if they had specific challenges. But in fact, I would say that the focus needs to be actively placed on the people, because of this growth reflex, the usual thinking would be, okay, we need new investment so that new people can come or appear magically and start producing and start living in our city. But we should never forget the people who are already there. And in fact, the priority should be reversed. It's always the people that already live there first, and then anybody else, be it new people being born, be people moving in, etc., etc. And by engaging the local communities, making sure that their voice is always there from the very beginning, then this long-term commitment becomes even easier for authorities, because they already know that people are actually in support of this plan. So the earlier they're involved, the better, because they can actually first provide this support, and second, they can also deliver part of the plan on their own, which is, for instance, what happened in Leipzig, where some of the measures were targeted to neighborhoods which have a tradition of local small businesses. And this is also more or less in line with German economy in general, but people were actually looking forward to these programs so they can they can open their own shop, or their own cafe, etc., etc. So they already have a livelihood and they have a stake in the whole transformation process. And this is crucial for our smart shrinkage.
We spoke earlier about kind of infrastructure and smart shrinkage around that and the kind of considerations. But I wanted just to ask you a bit about like technological solutions, I should say, and what sort of like emerging or established sort of smart technologies, if any, would work at that kind of city scale, and that can be used to, enhance the quality of life or design the city better. Are there kind of technologies that are being used for this sort of thing?
Maybe since we entered into the actual smart shrinkage, which is about technology and use, just to make sure that we're also using the proper terms indeed. So shrinking smart is the big planning concept, and then smart shrinkage might be a part of it or not so much.
Okay.
Thanks. Based on my observations, the technological solutions can support the efforts to actually collect data about the city as part of the shrinking smart process. One of the recommendations that I give is to actually perform a very in-depth assessment of what's available in the city, what's the profile of the population, just to collect any data that wasn't there before or needs to be updated. Because sometimes, again, because of this reflex of thinking along the same lines of growing, etc., there is an assumption that exists there, while, for instance, that there will be people that will work in a new factory that will be established, but then you create the factory and there is no one to work there because the population is old and you didn't know that. So I would say that especially big data solutions and type of monitoring instruments can be used in this direction to make sure that there's an in-depth assessment done for the city or the specific neighborhood that's being improved, and then the data can be made public, visualized in a nice way, and also be used to support communications about the whole process.
How is that done in practice? Because, I mean, we have obviously two mechanisms or processes for getting demographic data, which are like censuses, but they operate obviously at a different scale and a different sort of time frames, once every 10 years or whatever. How does a city go about trying to capture a specific demographic in a shorter space of time?
This is where I think partnerships with like knowledge institutes or bureaus or local planning agencies can help. And this also brings us back to the capacity question. So cities need to kind of assess what capacity they have and what can they actually procure as data, and then try to find partners that can actually help them obtain this data. In Leipzig, for instance, this type of capacity was also procured on regional and also state level from Saxony. So they actually built out the data as they were doing it and as they were planning the interventions. It's also sometimes an inevitable part of the process. So to create a plan for a certain neighborhood, you already need data, and if you don't have it, then the plan is going to be irrelevant. So in a way, that's also happening, based on needs. But if it's upgraded a little bit with a more concentrated effort in this, and for instance, partner with a university or with a local research center or anything else, then it can work.
And have you seen examples where it's not just about specific city, but like partnerships between cities that can share information either at national or international level? Because I think in other episodes we've seen that some examples are actually, it's not even a city in the same country, but it's just a similar city in another country and another region that has similar situations where that sharing of information could be more productive. Or have you seen any examples of that?
I think it can definitely help in terms of inspiring cities from one another and maybe seeing how things work elsewhere. So it's also part of the capacity building. But I think this increases more the risk of thinking that you can just do the same thing because it worked elsewhere, which is not necessarily the case. In fact, many people tried to follow Bilbao's example and it didn't work out. So if we talk about, symbolic and flagship type of changes, but this brings us again to the planning system and to the local context. So any experience from other cities needs to be assessed critically and to see whether, okay, does this actually make sense for us, or it just sounds nice because we can sell it, especially. So if politicians get involved in this type of exchanges, then it becomes even more difficult because, they tend to pick something that seems super shiny and great for campaigning, but it doesn't make any sense from planning perspective.
I guess that's when data analysis is not just collecting the data, right? It's managing it in a way that is actually helpful, but it could just give you information, exactly the information. This is applicable. This is going to be a solution that is kind of good for the city.
Exactly. Yes.
I was just also thinking about like collecting data and things there as well. With when a shrinking population in a city isn't a sort of a homogeneous shrinkage across the whole city. I guess desirable areas within cities may remain desirable for people to live in, but other areas may get kind of hollowed out, I guess, disproportionately. And that's probably maybe where collecting data feeds in to kind of ensure equity, or to think about what focused actions could be kind of taken for specific places. Would that be part of it?
Yes, exactly. This is the whole idea in the two examples that like in Bilbao and Leipzig, in both cases, this actually really helped, because you need to adapt depending on the specific neighborhood and its needs. And you form the specific intervention accordingly.
We talked about this idea of not aiming for growth, but how does it work on a political perspective, I guess, when the municipality would put forward a strategy to suggest that actually remaining stable or declining can be seen as positive? Does that work in practice?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest question in our field, in a way. Yes, so I think growth is so intertwined with planning as a field and as a practice. So, I mean, historically, I think the discipline has been informed by managing growth. So it's also a bit unrealistic, and I would say a bit radical, to completely say, okay, let's do no growth. So I'm not so much in favor of completely going in the other extreme. What I recommend, and from what I see based on my research, is to try to find the balance. So to look at growth or economic activity and quality of life on the same level, rather than saying one is better than the other, or the one should be given priority, etc. So even if they're on par, it can already work, because you're saying, okay, we want new industry, but we also want people to have nice homes, or to have green areas, or we also want to avoid being flooded. If you consider, let's say, resilience as part of quality of life, this is especially something that's going to become even a bigger problem in the future, and we're already seeing this every year with different examples. So I think this is where, from political perspective, to answer your question, Monica, things can be directed. How can we also recognize that quality of life can be something that can be sold politically and can be attractive for people to vote for, as opposed to just saying and promising jobs and work, which might arrive, it might not arrive, and it might arrive and then it might leave because of reasons. So why don't we focus at the same time on trying to make the life of the people that are already there better in terms of everything that's not economically related, while at the same time trying to figure out the economic situation? I think this is the direction where the political decisions should be directed to.
So kind of like, I think I've heard the expression like a sort of prosperous decline, where there may be a reduction in populations, but actually because it's been managed smartly, people have a good quality of life. They have, the things that they need, and they can access healthcare and schools and things, and remain prosperous within a sort of smaller or declining city in terms of population.
Yes, I think this is more or less the direction that I was heading. The thing is, if we talk about strictly from political perspective, it's very difficult to say, to use the word decline and then to say this is super positive because we're doing something else, So maybe if we go beyond this binary thinking of decline versus growth, and then just say, okay, no, our priorities don't matter, like don't pay that much attention to how many people are left in our city. We want to be a good place to live. We want to be a place where people would want to raise their children, for instance, or we want to be a place where people would want to retire, or we want to be a place with great nature, etc. So when you put this in front, then the other questions are easier to answer, I would say, because you would think about them from this perspective.
Because I think it's also being weaponized when you don't have good quality of living for the people who are there, as you rather mentioned. Politicians the migrants are coming for our jobs, they're taking yours. And that's really what's pushing all this hate against new communities. So I think, it's important to just secure first the livability of cities before.
Indeed, because when people do not have a good quality of life, they will be dissatisfied. And then the political approach to it would be, let's figure out what you're dissatisfied about. And here are some options. And then
look for someone to blame. Yeah.
It does need a very strong vision, though, to decide what should be the focus of a city and what areas should be looked at for the livability.
Indeed. And in fact, some political decisions already have consequences. Like we have a very fresh example from Bulgaria from last week, where some of the already available funds for the future shrinking cities, which are going to be the cities that should close their coal industry and shift to renewable energy, etc., which are supposed to be funded by the Just Transition Fund. Because of political games like this, they're actually going to lose the money that we're going to be given to those regions, over the next 20 years. And we're talking about significant amounts. So this is a very clear example of this lack of vision, where just this scapegoating and trying to figure out a way to keep people dissatisfied in a way, because it provides political gains, can have real financial consequences that can even make the lives of the future generations more difficult, not to mention the environmental consequences.
Yeah, there's definitely many examples in Italy of the same issue as well, where very polluting industries have been asked to change to improve their environmental outcomes, but then local political pressures and these scapegoating, as you mentioned, of the idea of losing jobs in the area meant that actually both local population and local communities advocated for these industries and jobs to remain exactly in the way they were, even though in the long run it would have been much more preferable to shift. Maybe last question as we're approaching the end of our hour, but what future trends do you foresee in the management of shrinking cities, as this is becoming a very topical topic on the global scale and not just in Western Europe anymore?
Indeed, I think specifically for the European context, this is already more or less the long-term trajectory, because Europe is losing population in the long term, and this will continue with different severity across the different countries. But I think the future issues of shrinking cities would be on top of the population decline, and either consequences or effects from this would be, of course, the environmental effects and the climate change adaptation, and the overall attempts to shift to a cleaner industry. So find a way to be part of this new type of economic dynamics, which are already stepping in. I'm not fully familiar with let's say the Asian or American context nowadays from this perspective, but this type of transition and figuring out a way to have less environmental impact is going to be an issue also for shrinking cities. So it doesn't really matter how many people live in your city when the changes that are happening and the consequences of climate change are there for everyone. So I think this would be something that shrinking cities will definitely need to work on. One of my projects that I'm currently involved in actually deals with figuring out a way to develop renewable wind energy projects for specific regions and make sure that they have that they incorporate the social buy-in from the local community. So how can we make sure that they're not just imposed out somewhere, but they're also owned and managed and recognized by the local population in a just way. So this type of solutions are going to be on the table, I think, for the future. And shrinking cities do have things to choose from, but they definitely need to commit to manage their shrinkage. Otherwise, it's not really going to work.
It's a perfect sum of what we should be focusing on as urban planners. So Is there one thing that you would like to see applied for shrinking cities and secondary cities in relation to this concept of shrinking smart? What would that be?
Yeah, this would be the commitment to manage whatever is happening to your city, the commitment to manage shrinkage, to be committed to act upon it rather than wait for it to be solved magically or for someone else to solve it. So really try to find this buy-in, try to find this commitment to manage. Even if you don't have a vision, you can still manage the consequences. And if we want to be fully on the spatial planning level here, the commitment would be to also try to be more compact and just reuse and adapt whatever is available there. Don't look for solutions that involve building new stuff. Just try to look at what's already there and then try to figure out a way to fix it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, thanks very much, Bozhidar. It was super interesting and very insightful as well. Thanks for being part of our discussion.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you, and indeed, a lot of time dedicated to shrinking smart. So looking forward to the end result as well.